Welcome back to Truth Behind History, where we unravel the stories behind the events that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into a topic that has shaped economies, fueled wars, and still echoes in modern politics: economic nationalism. What happens when countries prioritize their own wealth above all else? How did empires build global dominance through mercantilism? And why do trade conflicts from centuries ago still influence the policies of today? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll have a clearer understanding of how economic nationalism has shaped history and continues to do so in the modern world. Let's get started. To kick things off, let's define economic nationalism. At its core, it's the belief that governments should actively shape their economies to benefit national interests, usually at the expense of foreign competition. In other words, keep the wealth at home and limit reliance on outsiders. Sounds simple enough, right? But in practice, it reshaped the global economy in powerful ways. One of the biggest tools of economic nationalism was state-controlled trade. Governments didn't just let merchants and companies do whatever they wanted, they set strict rules to maximize national wealth. That meant heavy regulations, tariffs on foreign goods, and even outright monopolies granted to certain businesses. If you wanted to trade in the 17th and 18th centuries, chances were you had to play by the government's rules, or not play at all. Another pillar of this system was colonial resource extraction. European powers looked beyond their own borders for wealth, exploiting colonies for raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and precious metals. This created a one-way economic street: colonies provided resources, and the mother country got rich. And the effects of this system? Long-term global consequences. Many of the trade policies and power structures we see today, like protectionism and government intervention in economies, trace their roots back to these centuries-old practices. The question is, did this make countries stronger in the long run, or did it set them up for economic disaster? Let's take a closer look at one of the biggest players in this story: Spain. Spain was one of the richest empires in the world. But was it really wealthy? That's where things get interesting. Spain extracted over 150,000 tons of silver from its American colonies between the 16th and 18th centuries. That's an astronomical amount, enough to make Spain the economic powerhouse of Europe, or so they thought. In reality, this massive silver influx created as many problems as it solved. A huge part of this system was the encomienda system, a brutal labor structure that forced indigenous peoples to work in mines and agricultural plantations. The goal? To extract as much wealth as possible, as quickly as possible. But this came at an enormous human cost. Entire populations were wiped out due to overwork, disease, and violence. Spain's economy was booming, but it was built on exploitation and destruction. And here's where it all backfired: inflation. You'd think mountains of gold and silver would make Spain the wealthiest nation in history. Instead, it led to skyrocketing prices. More silver in circulation meant each coin was worth less. The result? Spain's economy weakened over time, and the empire that once ruled the sea started to crumble. This is a classic example of short-term economic gain versus long-term sustainability, something we'll see play out again with another major empire, the Dutch. While Spain was hoarding silver, the Dutch were doing something completely different. They weren't just taking wealth, they were creating it. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was the world's first true multinational corporation. Unlike Spain, which relied on colonial extraction, the Dutch focused on trade dominance. They controlled major spice trade routes, expanded global commerce, and, perhaps most importantly, used financial innovation to sustain their empire. One of their biggest contributions? The Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Founded in 1602, it was the world's first modern stock exchange. This allowed investors to buy and sell shares in trading ventures, making global trade more efficient and profitable. It's no exaggeration to say this laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. And here's the key difference between the Dutch and their rivals: economic liberalism. Unlike mercantilist nations that tried to hoard wealth through heavy restrictions, the Dutch believed in open trade policies. This fostered long-term economic growth, while others were stuck in outdated models. So what's the takeaway? While Spain's wealth was built on quick gains that led to collapse, the Dutch built a sustainable trade empire, one that influenced how modern economies function today. But if we're talking about global dominance, we have to talk about Britain. Enter Britain, an empire that didn't just adapt to global trade but revolutionized it. First, there was the Industrial Revolution. While other nations were still relying on manual labor and outdated production methods, Britain pioneered mechanized manufacturing. This supercharged productivity, leading to an explosion in trade and economic power. But what really set Britain apart was its colonial trade system. At its height, Britain controlled a vast global empire that supplied raw materials and provided markets for British goods. Essentially, they had a built-in economic engine. Colonies produced resources, British factories turned them into goods, and those goods were sold back to the colonies. It was a cycle that fueled Britain's dominance for centuries. And then, there's the Bank of England. Established in 1694, this financial institution played a critical role in Britain's long-term economic strength. Unlike Spain, which squandered its wealth, Britain created a financial system that allowed for sustainable growth, lending, and investment. Britain wasn't just playing the game, it was writing the rules. And those rules would shape the modern global economy. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's take a detour to France, where a very different kind of economic strategy was unfolding. Now, let's talk about France, and one of the most influential economic masterminds of the 17th century, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. If Britain and the Dutch were all about trade and finance, Colbert had a different vision for France, one where the state controlled everything. Colbert's policies, known as Colbertism, were rooted in government-controlled industry. He believed that for France to become an economic powerhouse, the government needed to protect its industries, subsidize key sectors, and establish state monopolies. This was the very definition of economic nationalism: France first, everyone else second. But Colbert knew that controlling industries wasn't enough. A strong economy needed infrastructure. So, under his leadership, France expanded its network of roads, ports, and canals, making it easier to transport goods and boost trade. More trade meant more wealth, which meant more power for France. And let's not forget colonial ambitions. France wasn't going to sit back while Spain and Britain expanded their empires. Under Colbert, France strengthened its navy, built overseas colonies, and positioned itself as a competitor on the global stage. Now, did Colbert's approach work? In the short term, yes. France's economy grew, and its industries became more competitive. But in the long run, heavy government control stifled innovation, and France struggled to keep up with the more dynamic economies of Britain and the Dutch. At this point, you might be wondering, if all these strategies shaped history, what about today? Does economic nationalism still exist? Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to the modern era. Fast forward to today, and we see economic nationalism making a comeback. Nations still protect their economies, just in new ways. One of the most obvious examples is tariffs and trade barriers. Governments impose tariffs to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, but this often leads to global trade conflicts. Think of it like a game of economic tug-of-war, each country trying to pull profits toward itself while pushing competitors away. Then, there's reshoring and economic sovereignty. In recent years, we've seen governments encourage companies to bring manufacturing back home instead of relying on foreign supply chains. The goal? To be less dependent on global markets and have more control over national economies. And of course, there are geopolitical trade conflicts. One of the biggest examples is the US-China trade war. For years, these two economic giants have been imposing tariffs, restricting exports, and trying to outmaneuver each other in technology and industry. And they're not alone. Economic nationalism is shaping policies in the EU, India, and beyond. So, what does this tell us? Economic nationalism isn't just a relic of the past, it's an ongoing force that still influences trade, industry, and global power dynamics. And now, let's wrap it all up with some final takeaways. So, what have we learned? First, the long-term economic impact of mercantilist policies is complicated. On one hand, they shaped global trade and built powerful economies. On the other, they often led to unsustainable growth. Spain's silver boom turned into inflation, and France's state-controlled approach struggled against freer markets. Second, we can't ignore colonial legacies. The wealth extraction and forced labor systems of past centuries had lasting consequences on former colonies, many of which still feel economic disparities today. The effects of economic nationalism aren't just in history books, they're real, and they're still shaping economies across the world. And finally, modern relevance. Economic nationalism isn't going away. Countries still use protectionist policies, trade barriers, and financial strategies to gain an advantage. The players may have changed, but the game remains the same. If you found this breakdown of economic nationalism interesting, make sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives into the forces that have shaped our world. Hit that like button if you learned something new, and drop a comment below. Do you think economic nationalism helps or hurts modern economies? And don't forget to check out our other videos if you're into history that actually explains how the world works. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.